The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
A lot of news today, and to start with, things are not going particularly well for the President of the United States. We've now learned that the White House, a number of White House advisors, have started to warn the president about the possibility of the impeachment process starting against him that he could potentially face at some point in the next, we don't really know how long. These things can take a long time. And what we can be sure of is that if Donald Trump were to be the target of impeachment proceedings, it would be the greatest impeachment ever, right, folks? I mean, we would have the best articles of impeachment of any administration, bar none. Not like the failing fake news media would have written about a potential Barack Obama impeachment. We would really have the biggest and best impeachment of all if it were to happen under Donald Trump. And we're seeing advisors warn Trump or prepare Trump for this in the wake of a Trump agenda, which, despite being bogus to begin with, doesn't really matter, has completely stalled. The Russia investigation is not going particularly well for Trump. Every week, some new aspect of the potential collusion and cover-up leaks. Approval ratings for Trump basically at this point stuck between 35 and 37%. And now, according to the Washington Post and Newsweek, it is not just one, but multiple White House advisors who have been talking to the president about the potential for impeachment and how that process would go. And Donald Trump has been scaling up the sort of antagonism against Republicans. And over the last month or so, we've seen everything from the direct attacks on Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to a couple of other more general tweets targeting Republicans, starting first with one where Donald Trump said, "It's very sad that Republicans, even some that were carried over the line on my back, do very little to protect their president." Donald Trump also tweeting late in July, "If Republicans don't repeal and replace the disastrous Obamacare, the repercussions will be far greater than any of them understand." We have to break this down into a few different elements. Number one, if Trump ever thought that his agenda was going to pass with the help of Democrats, he was obviously operating in a fantasy world. But now we're talking about Trump going after Republicans, saying, hey, some of you are here because of me. Maybe true in some cases, definitely not true in others. You'd better help me advance my agenda. And this is something that we've talked about almost from day one, really, which is Republicans don't seem to be particularly ideologically tied to supporting Donald Trump. It's more how it will affect their reelection chances. And when it comes to impeachment, do you think Donald Trump really even understands the potential of being impeached? Or does his delusional ego sort of preclude him from thinking something like that could even possibly happen? After all, how could the best deal maker in history ever end up in a situation where he might be impeached?
You know, if Donald Trump was impeached, it wouldn't just be from Democrats. You'd have to get some Republicans to go along with that.
No doubt.
And when he, specifically targets senators like John McCain and Jeff Flake and talks about maybe primary challenging them, going after the leader of the Senate Republicans, Mitch McConnell, it's just poor strategy because I think you have to hold on to at least, all but 19 of those Republican senators to keep yourself in power.
It's really, when you look at the numbers, as Pat is sort of pointing out, ultimately, if there is going to be impeachment of Donald Trump, it's going to depend on Republicans. And I wonder if that could really happen. I mean, would Republicans do it? Why would, even if you're a Republican in the House or Senate, and you don't particularly care for Trump's brand of so-called republicanism, which is really not, it's really just incompetence and ignorance, thinly veiled in populist rhetoric, actually with authoritarian tendencies, why would a Republican Congress, for example, impeach Trump when they can keep him and keep the attention on his scandals and get all of their bills rubber stamped by Trump? Yes, Trump does some things that Republicans don't like, but overall, Trump does provide Republicans cover to do mostly whatever it is that they want. Only if their reelection chances are at stake would they really consider impeachment. And then the other thing, and we're thinking ahead here, Democrats also need to think about whether impeachment is the best move, because that could put Mike Pence and Paul Ryan in charge of the Republican Party. And I've said this before, isn't the best solution that Donald Trump stays riddled with scandal and unable to really accomplish anything until 2020? I know we keep going back to this, Pat, but you could actually see Republicans accomplish much more if Donald Trump is impeached. And I don't think that is some crazy conspiracy theory. I think that's something Democrats really need to be thinking seriously about.
The issue that the Republican Party is facing is that there's such an ideological gap in between the conservatives and the moderates, and sometimes it's hard to bridge that gap. And regardless of if Trump or Pence is in power, I don't know if they're going to be able to consolidate their message and get what they want passed in that Congress.
That's interesting. There might be something to that. I mean, we've talked about what I see as the three divisions of the Republican Party are sort of the Mitt Romney type, low tax, pro-business, that wing of the Republican Party. You've got the religious conservatives, which interestingly enough, still a plurality voted for Donald Trump during the Republican primary, which was quite shocking. And then you've got the more Tea Party, anti-government types. And I think the healthcare repeal debacle is a good example of how Republicans are not united. And when you don't have a polarizing figure like Trump, I do believe that they would be able to get more on the same page because Donald Trump doesn't really fit into any three of those categories. And I think that we will have to wait and see ultimately what happens with this. But I do believe that Democrats need to be careful about what they wish for, because it could also end up not going particularly well for them. Okay, yesterday I told you that Donald Trump sought a Moscow real estate deal while running for president. It involved his attorney, Michael Cohen. It involved this Russian-American business guy named Felix Sater. We've now learned even more about the blatant nature of the coordination that took place, as well as about the relationship of these possible real estate deals to Donald Trump's political campaign. And it all now is involving Vladimir Putin. And it's kind of looking exactly like what we suspected for a long time. So Felix Sater is the Russian-American business associate of Donald Trump. Back in 2015, he was trying to put together a real estate deal specifically with Vladimir Putin's help, which he believed would help Donald Trump win the presidency of the United States. How are all aspects of this connected? Well, we've now learned that Felix Sater, who again, he's been on our radar for some time. We've talked about Felix Sater before, and I gave you some details about him yesterday. He wrote a bunch of emails to Donald Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, who is a pretty important figure in the Trump-Russia blackmail dossier. And in those emails, Felix Sater was bragging about his ties to Vladimir Putin. And he predicted that if they could get this Trump-Russia, Moscow Trump Tower deal done, that it would make Trump look like a really great negotiator, and it would help him in a presidential race. We now have our hands on some of these emails. Here is an email from Felix Sater sent to Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, in 2015, where he said, "Our boy can become president of the USA, and we can engineer it. I will get all of Putin's team to buy in on this. I will manage this process." This is as blatant as it can get. This wasn't like a vague or mere general statement. Sater claimed to have already set up the financing for this Moscow Trump Tower, specifically with the VTB Bank. That's also relevant since VTB Bank is under American sanctions for Russia's influence in undermining Ukrainian democracy, another story that we've been talking about for a while. Now, of course, there are many caveats here, right? Sater claiming to be close to Vladimir Putin is not proof that he's actually close to Vladimir Putin, right? He could have been exaggerating, for example. Every indication is that regardless of what Felix Sater promised Michael Cohen, very little of this actually happened. And of course, as I told you yesterday, the Moscow Trump Tower deal eventually fell apart. They ended up not getting the permits that they needed. They ended up not having the financing for the project. But here's where you sort of have to read between the lines and really look at what isn't being said. When the White House was asked for comment, they declined. They initially didn't respond to the Washington Post report that I told you about yesterday. Now, the New York Times has built on that report, and they were able to get a comment from the White House. And the statement from the White House, and again, you've got to look at the language that they use. The White House responded to the New York Times report by saying, quote, "To be clear, the Trump Organization has never had any real estate holdings or interests in Russia." Okay? That's a statement that we got yesterday. What they mean is no deal happened. Nothing was built. It doesn't actually deny or refute any of what we've learned from the Washington Post and the New York Times about Felix Sater and Michael Cohen, because it all appears to be true. We've got the email records, Pat. And when you look at the wording here, they didn't do the Trump Tower deal. No. That's their defense, which doesn't refute any of the reporting.
I think this also goes to this idea that if there is collusion, it's more financial collusion than about politics, because I don't know if Trump expected to win the presidency back in 2015. Maybe at that point it was just a big commercial for him still. Yeah. And Felix Sater is on this idea that just getting this deal passed would make him look like such a great negotiator that Americans would have to elect them. But that's not really a voting issue, is it?
I don't believe it is. I think that it reflects more Felix Sater's desire just to make money, right? I think that that's what is underlying this. And more, this entire Russia thing is pointing more towards financial misdeeds, greed, cronyism, and the like. Listen, folks, this I can tell you. The fake news media, New York Times is failing, by the way, is making this all up. And by the way, Russia, no. I've had no contact with Russia. Putin, never met him. This is all to cover up that crooked Hillary got schlonged by the DNC. Americans don't care about this. David Clark's new book, tremendous, by the way. Reading, Barron does incredible things with books. He knows hundreds of words. And why would it be bad to be friends with Russia anyway? Shouldn't we want, Pat, better relations with Russia?
Oh, man. And I think Felix Sater as well is one of these Trump associates who has a tough time keeping his mouth shut. Yeah. Because he said that he was going to show Putin and other Russian officials video clips of Trump boasting about how he loves Russia so much. Yeah. And that Sater wanted to become the ambassador to the Bahamas if Trump was to win.
Well, Sater is a growing figure in all this. As a sort of aside, because Pat opened the door to exploring Sater's history, sure. I will mention Sater supposedly not that long ago said that he expects both he and President Trump are going to end up spending time in prison. In about the next 30 to 35 days, he said in an interview with New York Magazine earlier this month, he believes he will be the, quote, most colorful character you have ever talked about. The calls are coming from inside the house. I'm sort of starting to think, guys, that there might actually be something. Really? To the Trump-Russia investigation. Yeah, I'm starting to go in that direction. And for those who still say there's nothing here, the story has been unraveling for more than a year, and nothing's been proven wrong. There are aspects that remain unproven, right? Like, does Donald Trump really have a fetish for urinating on Russian prostitutes? It has not yet been proven. It's in the Russian blackmail file. But the longer it goes, the more of the Russian blackmail file that is verified or corroborated or appears to be true. If this entire Trump-Russia thing were submitted as a screenplay, like to a movie studio, if you gave this to Steven Spielberg, he would page through it and he'd say, nah, it's too contrived and the dialogues aren't believable. Nobody would ever really write emails like these. And I don't believe that someone like this could ever become president of the United States. It just doesn't seem believable as a fiction script. And it's real life 2017. This is going to be an interesting week, I would predict.
Maybe it's more of a TV series where you can see that the episodes keep getting renewed and there's more and more seasons, but it's going to have to conclude at some point.
The storyline of what's happening is when a show does well in seasons 1 and 2, and they never really expected to get to season 3, but they get renewed, and now the writing starts getting a little bit far-flung and difficult to believe, and you're saying, you know, it's just no longer believable. That's reality right now.
It's like Game of Thrones, too, where there's so much turnover in the characters. I mean, remember Anthony Scaramucci? He was around for like a week.
Yeah, although I've never seen an episode of Game of Thrones, so I can't... Pat's signaling to go to a break. That's not something that I should be talking about ever. Never mentioned I haven't seen Game of Thrones. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. Follow me there.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Abelardo Sanchez. Abelardo, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. This truly is viewer and listener supported media. If you like the show, I say support the show. davidpakman.com/membership, patreon.com/David Pakman Show. And of course, if you ever shop on Amazon.com, davidpakman.com/Amazon, before you shop, that'll send us a little kickback. Everything you buy, no form to fill out, nothing confusing to sort through. You just go to davidpakman.com/Amazon. Anytime you buy something after using that link, we get a little kickback. We've got some free memberships to give away on that note. Patrick Ferreira came to me with a proposal for a membership giveaway. And we went back and forth a little bit, and we came up with a concept. And previously, we've done contests related to writing things. Progressive patriotism was one of them. We did a writing contest for free memberships, open only to high school and college students. We've had a number of these. And Patrick wanted this contest to involve some kind of visual art rather than something in the written form. So we're doing an Instagram-only contest, which will be using the hashtag DavidPakmanShow17. And if you want a free 1-year David Pakman Show membership, you have to create and post to Instagram some kind of fan art related to the show. That's it. There's no more restriction on it, right? It could be a drawing, it could be a painting, it could be handmade or computer or digital graphics. Even, I would argue, some kind of memes would qualify as sort of creative and artistic, such that they could qualify for this concept.
What about like a 3-dimensional sculpture?
Sure.
Can you take a picture of that, put that on Instagram?
You could do that. I don't know that anybody other than you will be doing that as a submission. But yeah, it can be anything related to the show. So it could be a caricature of me. It could be a painting of Pat's Keurig. It could be a comic strip related to some joke I've made on the show. It could be a sculpture, like Pat suggests. There just has to be some kind of clear link to the show, and you have to tag it on Instagram, hashtag DavidPakmanShow17, okay? It's not David Pakman Show 2017. I'm going to put up for people who are watching what the hashtag is, because if you don't put up the right hashtag, we'll just never see it. It is David Pakman Show 17. You can also tag me if you want. I'm david.pakman on Instagram. And by the way, you should follow me there, since I'll be reposting the winning submission on Instagram as well. I've got 5 of these free memberships to give away. Some kind of art, visual art related to the David Pakman Show, Instagram, hashtag David Pakman Show 17. I'm looking forward to this. The writing submissions have been extraordinary, and I have a feeling our audience will come up with great stuff.
I'm a little nervous, though, because if I'm caricaturized in some way, it just might not be flattering. It may not be as good as the one behind me here.
Oh, it's absolutely not going to be flattering.
No.
Yeah, there's no doubt whatsoever. You should be prepared for absolutely brutal visual content to be submitted. I like how Pat says he's worried it might not be flattering.
I don't know if I like this contest.
We paid for the one that's on screen to be done. That's the only reason it's flattering.
Okay.
99% of everything submitted by the audience is completely unflattering about both of us. Yeah, no. So I think you're spot on when it comes to that. I was watching my few daily minutes of MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News yesterday, and I happened to catch Ted Cruz on MSNBC in one of the various shelter facilities that are housing people that are displaced by Hurricane Harvey in Texas. And he imploded when Katy Tour asked him about his totally blatant hypocrisy on hurricane relief funds. And when I saw this, I knew I had to go back into our archives, because I was convinced. I don't remember. We do so many stories. Sometimes I forget. Did we do that story, or did I read that story a couple years ago? But I knew we had covered this before, and we did. Back on June 2nd of 2015, I reported to you that despite having voted against federal relief funding for victims of Hurricane Sandy, which impacted people mostly in the northeast of the United States, Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz was demanding federal funding for victims of Texas flooding that took place a couple of years ago. Cruz had voted against relief funds for Hurricane Sandy. He said it's all symptomatic of a larger problem in Washington. It's an addiction to spending money we don't have. But then when it came to money for his own constituents in Texas, he said, oh, listen, it's the federal government fulfilling its statutory obligations and stepping in to respond to a natural disaster. Well, he's at it again. And Katy Tour attempted to get him to explain this obvious double standard in some way other than, well, now it's my own constituents and I want to get reelected. And he wound himself up into a pretzel, a soft pretzel. At first, he tried not to answer the question at all. He sort of said, oh, that's political sniping or something like that. And Katy Tour didn't let him do it. Take a look.
But a lot of people are pointing out that you voted against aid for Sandy after that catastrophic storm up in the Northeast, that package back in 2012. And they're pointing at you and saying you're asking for money now when you weren't willing to help the people in the Northeast. What do you have to say to them?
Yep.
Well, you know, look, there's time for political sniping later. I think our focus needs to be on this.
It's not political sniping. Katy Tour is right. It's a pretty simple question of, hey, it appears you can be counted on to push for money for your own constituents, but to get in the way of money for non-constituents when they're all just victims of a natural disaster in the United States. So Katy Tour pushes him, and he eventually gives an answer, even though it's an answer that's been widely debunked for something like 5 years running.
These are people who needed money and who needed funding right after that storm. I covered those people. Many of them, just like those in Houston, lost absolutely everything they owned.
Well, Katy, of course, that's right. And the accurate thing to say is that I and a number of others enthusiastically and emphatically supported hurricane relief for Sandy. Hurricane relief and disaster relief has been a vital federal role for a long, long time, and it should continue. The problem with that particular bill is it became a $50 billion bill that was filled with unrelated pork. 2/3 of that bill had nothing to do with Sandy. And what I said then and still believe now is that it's not right for politicians to exploit a disaster and people are hurting to pay for their own political wish list. Disaster relief needs to be focused on the victims of disaster relief, and I supported that for Sandy, disaster relief there, and I would support that anywhere there's a major disaster without getting distracted by political unnecessary pork spending.
Oh, that bill had pork. I see. Well, let's evaluate that assertion. Oh, wait a second. It's been evaluated because Ted Cruz and other Republicans have been using it for years, and it's just not true. PolitiFact looked at it. They looked at that 2012 Superstorm Sandy relief bill. And many Republicans used this talking point. Some would say, well, 50 out of the $60 billion in the bill was pork. Ted Cruz and others would say 2/3 of the bill was pork. Others said 90% of the bill is pork. The truth is it's lies, and it's not actually clear exactly how much of the bill was pork. Now, don't get me wrong, Pat. A lot of the bill was pork. A lot of all of these bills is pork. It was not whatever percentage Ted Cruz thinks it was. It's true that there were some funds in that bill, as often is the case, that are for the future mitigation of natural disasters. So after a flood, you would have a bill that includes not only direct relief money for the victims of that flood, but also some money to strengthen infrastructure in case there's another flood in the future, because rarely is the most recent natural disaster the last natural disaster. But there's one other point I want to make here. Part of the reason that the 2012 Superstorm Sandy relief bill had pork in it was because you had red state Republicans like Ted Cruz who didn't want to support it unless they got some money for their pet projects. So Ted Cruz is exaggerating, number one. Number two, an incredible hypocrite. But it's his own colleagues that were demanding the pork.
And I just think that even if you're operating from a purely political perspective and not using your heart, not using empathy, wouldn't it make sense as a senator to support disaster relief for Sandy, even though that's not part of your constituency, because you realize that a natural disaster could hit you one day, and if not a hurricane or tornado or a blizzard or an earthquake, I mean, that's just how it goes.
It makes sense if you're just a sort of rational individual. It makes sense if you're just an empathetic individual. It makes sense if you're going to try to avoid being a hypocrite who falls victim to these insane double standards. And to be super clear, I'm not for a second saying that because Ted Cruz is a moron, we should punish the people of Texas and not give them aid. No, I think they should get the aid the same way I thought that the Superstorm Sandy victims should get the aid. Ted Cruz is the problem, and his constituents are the ones who need to realize that he's a problem and maybe vote him out, although it's not particularly likely.
And remember, Ted Cruz was the guy who was railing against New York values. What kind of values is he demonstrating here?
Not the hospitality that we associate with the South of the United States. I'll say that for sure. This is a major, major story, and it's not getting nearly the attention that it needs. We've talked about the problem of police militarization before. Major problem in the United States. Local police departments getting armored vehicles and grenade launchers and all sorts of military equipment. Now, a couple of years ago, President Obama actually issued an executive order back when those were bad and anti-democratic. Now, under Trump, executive orders are good. But, you know, back then, the executive orders were bad because it was Obama doing them. Obama's executive order banned the transfer of lots of military type equipment to local police departments after the unrest we saw in Ferguson, Missouri. Donald Trump is going to be rolling back those limits, and that is going to reopen the door to even more police militarization. And Attorney General Jeff Sessions actually spoke about the rollback of this ban at the yearly conference of the Fraternal Order of Police in Nashville, Tennessee. Very friendly crowd to Jeff Sessions, multiple standing ovations, very, very scary stuff. And here's part of what Jeff Sessions said in explaining the rollback of this ban. He said, "We are fighting a multi-front battle. An increase in violent crime, not true, crime is down, a rise in vicious gangs, an opioid epidemic, threats from terrorism, combined with a culture in which family and discipline seem to be eroding further, and a disturbing disrespect for the rule of law. The executive order the president will sign today will ensure that you can get the life-saving gear that you need to do your job and send a strong message that we will not allow criminal activity, violence, and lawlessness to become the new normal." The opioid crisis. The opioid crisis is on the list of reasons that Jeff Sessions believes local police need to be more militarized. He cites a culture in which family and discipline seems to be eroding as part of why local police should be militarized. How do tanks in the streets bring families together? How are we better off with armored vehicles driven by camouflage-wearing police officers with shoulder-mounted grenade launchers in our cities and towns? And again, he cites this increase in violent crime. Violent crime is down big in the United States in the last 30 years. And you can find some specific cities where during a specific 2 or 3 year period in the last decade, there's been somewhat of an increase in violent crime. But the trend continues. Violent crime is down significantly in the United States. And underlying this, there's probably nothing about Donald Trump's philosophy on the police that's leading him to do this. It might be as simple as this vendetta against President Obama and just trying to overturn anything that Barack Obama did. I don't know, Pat, that we're really learning anything here about Donald Trump's philosophy on law enforcement. He just wants to undo anything Obama did.
That may be so, and I think if there was ever a time to roll back police militarization, it would be now, considering, I mean, the incidents in Ferguson and around the country, but also just because violent crime is down so much. And if they're not going to advocate for that now, when the time is most opportune, they're never going to do it. And it just goes to this idea that, you know, the military-industrial complex is just something that's going to be perpetual, because this is really the last leg of it, trying to get the last dollars you can out of it by selling a lot of that equipment back to the police.
Some is being sold, some is being given away in the defense of some of these police departments. But I decided to be thorough, so I looked into, well, are there studies that tell us what happens in cities and towns or counties where you see more police militarization? And there's actually a study about this. It's called Police Officer on the Front Line or a Soldier: The Effect of Police Militarization on Crime, and it's been published in the American Economic Journal. The headline is, hey, when you give military aid to local police, you see lower crime rates, which strikes us as, wow, that's interesting. How is that going to work? And when you look at the study, and a lot of people that like police militarization point to this study, they don't really understand it. Military aid, according to this study, includes everything from non-lethal crowd dispersal equipment to office supplies. If it comes from the military, it's considered military aid. So that doesn't really say anything about how grenade launchers reduce crime or have a deterrent effect. What it tells us is police departments that generally have more resources correlate with decreases in crime. And that is not a defense for tanks in the streets as controlled by police departments. Last thought on this. What I will never understand, and maybe you can explain it to me, Pat, maybe someone in the audience can explain it to me. How is it that many of the same people that say we need guns to protect ourselves from a potentially tyrannical government want the police having bigger and badder weapons? Isn't that going to make it more likely that the government could become tyrannical, which is something you're trying to protect yourself against? I don't get it.
It's this real cognitive dissonance where they think that the government is purely about politicians and not so much the folks on the ground. These are also the people who will support the police no matter what, and are susceptible to fear-mongering. And I think that's exactly what Trump and Sessions are trying to do here.
Well, think about the big picture, right? Trump backs a heavily armed alt-right. He says there are very fine people among neo-Nazi protesters. Still haven't gotten a list of those fine people that are the neo-Nazi protesters. And he wants local police to be more heavily armed. Add it to the list of the move towards authoritarianism. You can discuss this with us on our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/Reddit.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined on the program today by Professor Assa Auerbach, who is professor of physics at Technion in Israel and has also written a graphic novel, Max the Demon versus Entropy of Doom, which explains the generally complex concepts of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics in terms that we can all hopefully understand. It's so great to talk to you. Let's sort of start at the very beginning. The concept of entropy. I have read what I would consider to be a fair amount for a layperson about the concept, and it's still quite difficult for me to sort of explain it to someone else, which I think is sometimes a good way to explore whether one actually understands something. Can they explain it to somebody else? So how can we start thinking about the concept of entropy?
Well, entropy is a tricky subject to explain, and it's something that is taught only at high-level courses in universities. There's a huge barrier for explaining entropy to most students, which is the math that you need to know, the multivariate calculus, some statistics, and so on. But it's a very important concept, and one that governs essentially the energy flow. And it tells us, how energy will flow from hot to cold, from low entropy systems to high entropy system. And it tells us about why pollution always grows. It's a concept that is very crucial for understanding a lot of the problems facing our world, actually, including global warming and other energy crisis, water pollution, and so on. So now that I said it's an important concept and it's a tricky one to explain, I think that there are actually certain ideas that people connect to that can give a long way towards understanding entropy, and that's the relation between order and disorder. A system that is ordered naturally becomes disordered under time. We know that from daily experience. And entropy is, in a sense, measuring the amount of disorder in a system, but one has to define what you mean by order and disorder. But it's something that intuitively a lot of people connect to. So we thought that in this comic book, we can actually make it more accessible, make entropy more accessible to lay people without going through the math, by connecting to the ideas of disorder.
So maybe let's do a couple of examples, if we can, when we think about the concepts of order and disorder. Can you give us one example of how, over time, we would naturally expect to see more disorder?
Right. Well, we have daily experience that, when you let a kid loose in a room and all the toys are ordered on the shelf, after a while, all the toys are scattered around without any particular order. And that's something that happens naturally. And if you keep on waiting, it won't order itself. Now, that's an example from human behavior. But It also happens when you mix milk in the tea. I mean, you just put the milk at one particular point in the tea, and after a while, the milk is spread all around. So the position of the milk molecules become highly spread out and less ordered.
That's an interesting one because, and I think that that's a good one because sometimes some of the most effective examples that I've read about how to understand the concept of entropy are those which explore that you could not possibly go backwards with some of these examples. In other words, once you imagine putting milk into tea, you initially see sort of a division between the milk and the tea. And whether or not you start stirring to sort of homogenize that mixture of milk and tea, there's really no way to undo that process. There's no way to separate the milk from the tea back out. And for me, that's been a crucial aspect of understanding this concept.
Right. This is a demonstration. I wouldn't call it understanding from the physicist's point of view, because you just look at the phenomena and you say, oh, I recognize this. So that's a good demonstration of entropy increasing over time and not decreasing. The reasons for that are actually quite deep. And it took a long time until physicists actually understood the reasons for disorder always to grow. That's called the second law of thermodynamics. For a long time, the second law was actually an axiom, was another postulate that you added to the classical mechanics we all know of Newton. But much later, it was understood that this is actually a natural course of events when you have many, many particles in the system. When you have lots and lots of what you call degrees of freedom, the chaotic motion of particles which interact with each other leads to the increase of entropy and to the second law of thermodynamics. Now, the comic book that we wrote was about an imaginary creature that Maxwell, the famous physicist that invented electromagnetism, thought about as a way of disputing the second law. He said, there could be a creature, essentially like ourselves, that would put order in things, and you won't have to spend any energy doing that. You will just have to open and shut the door and order things, separate gases between two different compartments into a high pressure and a low pressure, or a hot and a cold, or reverse essentially the arrow of time by just observing the different particles and allowing and disallowing them to move in certain ways. And that was a puzzle. That was a paradox that kept physicists busy for more than 60 years or 70 years until it was understood that such a creature cannot exist, and therefore the second law of thermodynamics was saved. This is actually the topic that is explained in our book. It's the fact that a Maxwell demon is a demon. He's not something that we can design, let's say nowadays with robots and nanoelectronics. It's an impossibility in physics, and it's quite a tricky subject to understand.
And why is it important to the sort of day-to-day lives of humans? In other words, conceptually, we may or may not understand entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, but in what ways does this impact our lives?
Well, the second law impacts our life immensely. The fact that we can only get useful energy from low entropy sources, which is fuel, sunlight, and so on, and we can't use all the immense amount of energy that we have in just tap water, just from the heat of the temperature of the oceans. We can't use that energy. This is a consequence of the second law. And when we want to understand where we can get energy that we could use from and where we cannot, we have to know the second law. So this is why it's important for our daily lives. It also tells us that what we have to concentrate on is not the energy, but the lower entropy. So it focuses discussions on the right topic, and I think most people in the public are not really aware of the importance of understanding entropy. So this is connected to our problems of energy and pollution, but conceptually, I think it's important to understand that the laws of nature have this natural increase of disorder. It's something that is one of the most fundamental laws that even Albert Einstein claimed. He believes that this is the one law that will never be proven incorrect. So it's a very important laws in physics and engineering. And as I said, it's a bit tricky to explain why this law exists in the face of ideas like Maxwell-Demon or mechanized Maxwell-Demon that people have tried to create and failed. So that's motivation we have.
I encourage the audience to check out the graphic novel Max the Demon versus Entropy of Doom. We've been speaking with Assa Auerbach, who is professor of physics at Technion in Israel. So great to speak to you today.
Well, thank you very much.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There was a very, very interesting interview over the weekend on Fox News Sunday, which is Fox News' version of the sort of Sunday morning political talk show. And Chris Wallace pointed out to Secretary of State Rex Tillerson during this interview that the world community, sort of at large, is increasingly concerned with Donald Trump's seemingly casual or even accepting attitude towards really horrific and vile racism and xenophobic groups and people. For example, the United Nations recently condemned Trump for not condemning racism in the wake of the Charlottesville debacle that took place during our vacation. And Chris Wallace asked Rex Tillerson, do the values of President Trump align with what we consider to be American values? And Rex Tillerson, the top diplomat of the United States, said, hey, Donald Trump speaks only for himself. Period.
Finally, and I've got a little over a minute left, the controversy over the racial protests in Charlottesville and the president's response to it has become an international issue. A UN committee this week criticized the Trump administration for, quote, its failure at the highest political level to unequivocally reject and condemn the racist, violent events and demonstrations. And here was the president in Phoenix this week talking more about the media than he was about the neo-Nazis and the Klan. Here he is.
The only people giving a platform to these hate groups is the media itself and the fake news.
Does that make it harder for you to push American values around the world when some foreign leaders question the president's values?
Chris, we express America's values from the State Department. We represent the American people. We represent America's values, our commitment to freedom, our commitment to equal treatment of people the world over, and that message has never changed.
And when the president gets into the kind of controversy he does and the UN committee responds the way it does, it seems to say they begin to doubt whether we're living those values.
I don't believe anyone doubts the American people's values or the commitment of the American government or the government's agencies to advancing those values and defending those values.
And the president's values?
The president speaks for himself, Chris.
Are you separating yourself from that, sir?
I've made my own comments as to our values as well in a speech I gave to the State Department this past week.
Wow. I just realized, by the way, that Rex Tillerson is like a Texas version of Sean Connery talking about expressing his values. I know this kind of seems like, okay, no big deal. There's way crazier stuff going on, and that's true. But this is the Secretary of State saying, listen, Trump says what he says. I've spoken about my values. And he is clearly distancing himself and the American people at large from the values that Trump seems to portray. And rightly so. I mean, Trump seems to have no real values to speak of other than cronyism, deranged grandiosity, and greed. And so much nonsense has been normalized by sort of the sheer idiocy of the Trump administration. This could easily get lost in the mix. The Secretary of State is on national media not acknowledging that his values are in line with those of the President of the United States for whom he works. This is a big deal.
And I really think that Tillerson's comments here were planned out. It wasn't like it was a gaffe or anything that he accidentally said.
Yeah, totally.
Now, normally this would be, the response would be some sort of firing or his forced resignation. But I just think that Rex Tillerson understands that Donald Trump doesn't really have the political capital at this point to do that.
Yeah.
Because he's been firing way too many people. It's like The Apprentice. And the Secretary of State is just such an important role.
It's funny how people that I would never normally agree with on anything sort of come through as voices of reason when compared to Donald Trump. Like Jim Mattis doesn't know whether this total ban on the transgender community from the military makes total sense. Wow, seems comparatively reasonable. Secretary of State Tillerson doesn't think an escalation of megalomaniacs into World War III vis-a-vis the North Korea situation is a great idea. Seems kind of reasonable. The sort of Overton window of insanity is moving under Trump because he's just so out there on so many issues.
And it might be because Tillerson is making his exit strategy for leaving the White House soon. And as a guy who's been in business his whole life and now as a diplomat,
yeah.
I mean, PR is very important to him. So he can't just tacitly agree with the comments that Trump made on Charlottesville.
I don't agree with the guy on basically any of his politics, but you can't really say Tillerson's not a careful guy when it comes to what he says publicly. Sometimes it's the big things with Donald Trump. Sometimes it's the little things. In this case, it's a little thing that gives us insight into Trump's personality. This is so funny. Trump welcomed the president of Finland, Sauli Niinisto, to the White House. And they did a press conference, pretty common thing. They both go out there, they take questions. And at one point, Donald Trump sort of goes off script instead of, I think normally like he'll take 4 questions and his visiting diplomatic guest will take 4 questions or something like that. But Trump goes off script and he gives the Finnish president the opportunity to take one more question. Niinisto calls on a female journalist, and Trump seems to think that it's the same woman who had just asked a question. Apparently, Trump was not able to tell the 2 women apart. And if you're watching this short clip, you'll notice the Finnish president looking visibly surprised by this. Take a look.
There might be a couple of more questions, but do you want to take one more? Would you want to take one more? Go ahead, pick.
Well,
Go ahead.
Please.
Again? You're going to give her the same one?
No, she's not the same lady.
Go ahead.
They are sitting side by side.
We have a lot of blonde women in Finland.
Yeah, the reporter noting there are lots of blondes in Finland. Now, it's possible Trump just wasn't paying attention to who previously asked the question, but if that's the case, why say anything at all? And this is just a dumb little story, but it goes along with the idea that Trump mostly sees women as ornaments, which by all indications is true. It's just an embarrassment in every way. Trump is finding sort of new and creative ways to be the prototypical embarrassing American on the world stage. It's never a good look to appear to be unable to distinguish between members of X group of people, and whether it's this group always, members of this group look alike or that group. And in this case, you know, blonde Finnish women are not exactly a marginalized group, but Donald Trump's history with women in general is not particularly good. And I was thinking, maybe Trump really doesn't believe he tried to grope multiple women, even though it was more than a dozen different women. Maybe he thought it was all the same woman because he can't tell them apart.
I think the real question is this just about women? Because I don't know if he would do the same thing to, say, 2 white male reporters from France, or is he just so disconnected from everyone that's around him?
Yeah, I think that that's a fair question. I think the guy is just living in his own world completely, and the female reporters, for their sake, they didn't really seem bothered. They were probably thrilled to be out of pea-grabbing range, if you know what I mean, going back to that TMZ tape. Could Trump find Finland on a map? Like if you put a map of the world in front of Trump with no labels on the countries, you think he could point to Finland?
I think he'd get the continent right. That's all I'm going to give him, though.
Well, that's actually funny. Like, I wonder if you gave Trump an unlabeled map of Asia and said, sir, could you point to Finland on this map? Would he say, no, this is a map of Asia and Finland is in Europe? Or would he not even realize that? Like, I genuinely believe he lacks some of the most basic knowledge about just everything that we, in a way, take for granted that is part of a normal education in some sort of general sense. I don't know if we'll ever find out, but that would be an interesting little experiment. We've got a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Let's take a listen to this voicemail that came in.
Yeah, just caught your show for the first time. It's fantastic. I'm 58-year-old liberal redneck. We are definitely up-and-coming force in this country. But anyway, man, I dig what you're doing. Keep up the good fight. Things are getting scary out there.
Thank you.
And have a good one.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know, sometimes, Pat, we get accused on the program of being Northeast elitist liberals who discriminate against people on the basis of Southern accents, and that is not true. I discriminate against people on the basis of idiotic political beliefs. And we have endless viewers and people in our circles that are what you might colloquially refer to as rednecks, and they are progressive, and they understand the problems of what's going on in our country.
And they are out there. There's a popular YouTuber by the name of Trey Crowder who describes himself as a liberal redneck, and I got to say I agree with most of what he has to say.
All right, on the bonus show today, yesterday I filled you in on my vacation to my birth country of Argentina. On today's bonus show, we will hear from producer Pat about his excellent adventure across the United States. A few of the things that are involved are Craigslist ride requests.
Yes.
Soylent. Auto mechanics.
Yes.
And ethanol fuel. Is that fair?
That's
like just as a little bit of a preview. So those aspects and many more of Pat's vacation on today's bonus show. DavidPakman.com/membership to sign up and get instant access. And soon, bonus show availability is coming to Patreon as well. Patreon.com/DavidPakmanShow.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com.